Welcome to Teaching Truth. God made countries. God makes kings and the rules by which they govern. And those rules say that the Sabbath is his. And I, for one, intend to keep it that way. The words of Eric Liddell, the athlete and missionary in the film Chariots of Fire, as he was brought up before the Olympic Committee in the 1924 Paris Olympics. The committee consisting of the future king and the Duke of Sutherland, along with Lord Cadogan and Lord Birkenhead. Brought up before the Olympic Committee to explain why he would not bow to running on a Sunday. God made countries. God makes kings and the rules by which they govern. And those rules say that the Sabbath is his. And I, for one, intend to keep it that way. Words that could well have had been uttered by Daniel and his three friends to King Nebuchadnezzar at the time they refused to bow down to the image of gold. And at the time, they were faced with being thrown into the fiery furnace. For Daniel and his friends, it was literally now a case of being out of the frying pan and into the fire. Let's read God's word together from Daniel chapter 3, verses 15 through to 23. If you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us from it, and he will rescue us from your hand, O king. But even if he does not, we want you to know, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude towards them changed. He ordered the furnace to be heated 7 times hotter than usual, and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. Yeah, Daniel and his friends had come out of the frying pan of the challenge of bowing down to the image of gold, and now they were into the fire that had been heated 7 times hotter than usual. It must have been very, very, very hot indeed. King Nebuchadnezzar must have had special respect, though, for Daniel and his friends and the work that they did in the empire over the last 20 years, because he gave them another opportunity to comply with his orders. Gave them a second chance to bow down to this image of gold. He was offering them, as it were, a great escape, an exit strategy. But King Nebuchadnezzar had a short memory, because he arrogantly asked in Daniel 3:15, who is the God that will deliver you out of my hands? But he had forgotten what he'd said in Daniel 2:47, that he'd call their God the God of gods and the Lord of kings. In other words, Nebuchadnezzar was claiming to be a god himself. He was putting himself on a pedestal. And the reality for King Nebuchadnezzar was that in a very short time, he would be knocked off his perch, off his pedestal, and would be humbled. Against that backdrop of being offered a second chance, a great escape, if you like, Daniel and his friends could easily have compromised with King Nebuchadnezzar. They could easily have said to themselves, well, everyone else is doing it, let's just bow down and get this over with. Or, you know what, we will bow our knees physically, but spiritually will not bow our hearts. Or they could have thought to themselves, well, you know what, we can do our people more good by being officers in the king's service rather than being ashes in the king's furnace. But they didn't, because they knew the importance of a good confession. And that's what we want to think about today, the confession, the good confession that Daniel and his friends made, and the good confession that we are challenged to make when we face a different kind of fiery furnace situation. Faith and a good confession rests on God's commands and promises. It's often said that times of adversity, and real fiery furnace situations bring out the best in people. And that was certainly true in the life of Daniel and his friends. You see, Daniel and his friends weren't concerned about themselves, nor were they afraid of the fury of the king. Their only concern was to give a faithful witness to all who were watching and listening. And remember, there were governors, advisors, treasurers, magistrates, provincial officials, hundreds, probably thousands of people gathered on that day on the plain of Judah, bowing down to this image. And yet, these three men did not do that. They were more concerned about a good confession than compromise. I love the story that's told of the young police officer who was taking his final exam at Hendon Police College in North London. And one of the questions he was asked in the exam paper was this: you're on patrol in outer London when an explosion occurs in a gas main in a nearby street. On investigation, you find that a large hole has been blown in the footpath and there is an overturned van lying nearby. Inside the van, there is a strong smell of alcohol. Both occupants, a man and a woman, are injured. You recognise the woman as the wife of your divisional inspector, who is at present away in the United States. A passing motorist stops to offer you assistance, and you realise that he is a man who is wanted for armed robbery. Suddenly, a man runs out of a nearby house, shouting that his wife is expecting a baby, and that the shock of the explosion has made the birth imminent. Another man is crying for help, and having been blown into an adjacent canal by the explosion, he cannot swim. Now, bearing in mind the provisions of the Mental Health Act, describe in a few words what actions you would take. The young police officer thought for a moment, picked up his pen and wrote, quote, I would take off my uniform and mingle with the crowd. We can sympathise, can't we, with his answer. As Christians, it's often easier to take off our Christian uniform and mingle with the crowd. But we're called to remain distinctive, to retain our identity wherever we are and whatever the circumstances. Daniel could easily have taken off his uniform and mingled with the magistrates, with the governors, with the advisors, with the treasurers, with the judges, to mingle with the crowd. But he didn't. He remained distinctive because he had a good confession. He knew that God could deliver them. But even if he didn't, they would trust him. That is how faith operated in the life of Daniel and his friends, and how faith is supposed to operate in our lives. They were men of faith, not men of presumption. Had they presumed that God would deliver them, that might have been a bit arrogant because they didn't know what God had willed for them in that situation. Rather, they stated that God was able to deliver them, but even if he didn't, they still wouldn't fall down before the king's golden image. They would not take off their uniform and mingle with the crowd. May we be those people like Daniel and his friends, and not like the young police officer, who even when faced with a fiery furnace situation, may we be those people who would not take off our uniform and mingle with the crowd, but would instead give that good confession for Jesus Christ.